joining me today. My name is Susan Sorensen. I'm the product owner for Kuali Research Administration. And today I'm happy to present Victor Kinzer. He'll begin here in just another moment. Before we start that off, I did have a couple of questions that we wanted to ask to really engage you here as the audience. We were pleasantly surprised that this particular webinar had a record-breaking number of attendees, and now that we know that hundreds of you are interested in this particular topic, we do want to make sure that we are gathering as much information as possible to make sure that we're addressing concerns that are relevant to you in the community. So the first thing that we wanted to ask to try to get as much information as possible is one of the things that would be helpful for us when Victor's giving the presentation today is he'd like to know, do most of your faculty use administrative support, or do they do their own support? Again, every school is sort of a unique snowflake here, but for the most part, do most of your faculty use admin support, or are they doing it by themselves? So when you do select one of these radio prompts here, at the end we will be able to see shortly after this what everyone on the call is saying, so that's kind of a fun participation point here that you'll get to see what everyone else is doing as well. Great, so fun. Okay, so it looks like most of the people on the call here today do have some administrative support for their faculty members, and that a third of you basically are saying that your institutions have the PIs do it all by themselves. Again, I wanted to welcome everyone to use the questions section to ask any questions as we go through the presentation. You need not wait until the end of the presentation. You can ask your question as it's at the top of your mind. So now we will begin. This is going to be a recorded session, so you can always go back and look or share with your friends and colleagues. Today is our presentation for techniques to dramatically improve your proposal development, and today's presenter is our newest Kuali representative. He's a functional consultant here at Kuali, Victor Kinzer. Many of you will know him from the Kuali community. He's been engaged with us for several years. He has over a decade of experience in research administration, primarily working at the grants office at Indiana University. And then he moved on to their implementation team there, where he assisted with the deployment of those particular modules, and that he also served us here in the community as a pre-award co-chair for several years. After he stepped down from that position, he did do some work with the research compliance team at Indiana University, and that he also has experience doing currently implementations here at Kuali. So we are very excited to have Victor be part of our team now, and I wanted to welcome you and him and say, Victor, we are very excited to see what you have in store for us today. Thank you so much. Let's get started.
Thank you. So you're probably going to see a couple terms in this presentation that you've seen before, and you might think, oh, those are developer terms. Those are design terms. You know, I don't really think about that stuff so much. This really is intended for functional implementers, so that the grants directors, the grants processors on an implementation team that are giving feedback, that are helping make implementation decisions. Excuse me. The thing that I ran into as I got farther and farther into implementation is the realization that there are a lot of tools being used by developers right now that would be very useful in the hands of the actual implementation team. And I want to talk about a couple of those and how I've seen them improve implementations and really improve the overall experience once a system is live. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of user experience, or UX. And you've probably seen this term before, and it might feel like it's interchangeable with UI design, UI being user interface. And UX, or user experience, is really the overall complete experience front to back of a user getting into a system. The technical definition I've seen most often, which I have on the slide, the overall experience of a person using a product such as a website or computer application, especially in terms of how easy or pleasing it is to use. And we all know, a lot of our users don't really want to be in doing what they're doing. It's a much easier lift when you're working in a system, if you're in Facebook or Twitter and someone's doing that for fun, it's easier. They're in a different mindset. Having to engage with, oh, I have to do all this stuff to get my proposal in, they come at it from a different place. So it's even more important that everything be as pleasing as it can be, given that it's administrative software, to get a really good response and good buy-in from especially your faculty, but also your administrative and central office staff. So just to talk about, how does this impact you? I mean, isn't this something the developers and the designers do? Well, user experience doesn't really end with user design. You take your piece of software, something like Kuali, and then the way you configure it, the way you set it up, can result in a dramatically different experience for two different schools. And some of that is inevitable. The two different schools will just have different, regulations in their states, or different processes and policies locally they have to implement. But some of it really just comes down to choice and how much time they spend thinking about the experience of their user can make a big difference. One thing I really, really encourage is include your whole implementation team in overall user experience analysis. You can sit down and you can look at how you're configuring the system and say, all right, well, what really is the user going to experience? What are they going to see? What are we asking from them? And can we make it easier? And the thing to realize is that every time you make something easier for the faculty or for the unit admins doing a proposal, you might be making it harder for your central staff. And so really understanding where expertise lies, what the culture is, what sort of support is available, helps a lot in understanding who should you really put the burden on, because that answer will be very different in different institutions. So then the question is, how do you do that? I mean, your people, at least you think you do. One of the tools that's used a lot in modern development is the idea of a user persona, where you take a theoretical person that's going to use your system. In this case, I've sort of created a draft user persona, and we have a PI. And you list details about them. What are their goals? What are their motivations? Who are they, especially in relation to the software? And how is that going to influence things? And this might seem a little excessive at first, to be honest. That's a response I've seen a lot when people look at this. They think, oh, this is a lot of time and setup and work if I'm going to set up all these personas. But it can really make a big difference because, say with this persona, a lot of implementations that I've worked with will have representation from different campuses, different major schools at a university. And if you go through this process and have the people that represent large swaths of the university write up, well, what do my PIs look like? And you bring them together, you can immediately see, oh, wow, these are very different sorts of setups. When I was working at IU, there were two major campuses, and the PIs on the two campuses had different levels of support. They had different established cultures around the way they engaged with previous systems, how much they did in the system, what types of grants they were submitting. So looking at this, someone from another school might say, that's great that your PI has extensive admin support, but we have all of these people over here that don't. The other thing that's really useful about this exercise is you can start to see how the people that use the system will relate to each other. Because you can take your personas and say, all right, we're going to create an overall workflow for what happens with a proposal. So does the PI enter it? Does a unit admin enter it? And you might set up a timeline, a workflow, and then have a few people say, that's really not true all the time. But if you don't put it up there for people to see, that conversation doesn't end up happening. Now, I will say, if you go out and you sort of look at other guides on how to use user personas for development, they're incredibly involved, and they'll have you build dozens of personas and these incredibly complicated workflows. I do think that at the implementation stage, because this tends to be something that's talked about for development, you can scale that back. I mean, we all only have so much time on our hands, and you can just kind of have the conversation, set aside a couple weeks at tops, maybe even just a couple days, depending on how large your implementation is, for some discovery and conversation around this, and kind of build this out and have it as a resource, because you'll be able to use it later as you start to sort of build features that aren't development build features, but build features with the tools in the system that your grant system has available. And I'll be showing what some of those look like and demoing them a little later. So, why do you use personas? I talked a little bit about differences with schools. The other big advantage of personas is if you have consultants that are coming in, if you have, maybe not even a consultant, maybe they're employees, they came up from one grants office, your implementation includes 3 grants offices, and they're not really in the work anymore, they're now moving on to analysis, they need to know who's really going to use the system. And so by building out these personas, they have a reference to go back to really understand that when they start to design questionnaires, when they start to design validations and those sorts of things, to go, all right, how is this really going to work? And how is this going to impact people? It's also really useful, like I said, for lining it up to know where different users will touch the system. And I'll be talking a little bit about one particular option in Kuali where, depending on how you configure it, your actual workflow order can change. Who touches the system in what order may be different in different schools based on the configuration, and it impacts which features are really available to you to use. And so if you set this up and have a conversation and you really understand why you're using a specific order, then that'll help you down the road when you're looking at, well, what are our other options for other validations to kind of save time, to eliminate time wasters, to improve overall experience, to know, oh, this would be great, but we really can't use the workflow that would be required for that. We really can't have people in the system in that order because we don't have the right expertise or culture for it. We don't want to put users through this other workflow that would be required. So I have a little bit of an example, and the example deals with the NASA regulation around China involvement from any government representatives or companies from China. So you have your proposal, and let's say at your institution, you've looked at some personas, and you decide we have pretty savvy PIs. They don't have access to a lot of admins in their units. We're not going to be able to change that. So the PI is going to initiate a proposal. That's great. There are going to be a few units over here where maybe an admin will initiate the proposal, but most of the time it'll be the PI. And then the PI will go in and they'll certify and they'll answer all their certification questions on the proposal. And then based on that, it'll display a validation that's driven by their question entry. Sorry about that, little bit of a typo there, saying, you've indicated that there's involvement by China. You need to contact your grants office. You need to understand the limits of this. And then that can initiate a conversation about, well, what does this really mean? Who are you actually engaging with? Because they may have answered yes, and maybe it isn't an issue. Maybe the person they're engaging with just lives in China. They don't actually represent any companies or the government. And you can catch those things because a lot of times with proposals, it'll get all the way through the routing and you don't identify that there's this detail that needs more investigation until you're halfway through review because you aren't capturing it. But if you just put it in the questionnaire, do the right people see it? And that's where some of this process can come into play, because who needs to see this message? If you put it in the general questionnaire, there are these 5 units over here that an admin does the overall proposal and the PI only really looks at their certification in the system. Sure, they put together everything that's been attached. They can say, yes, this is all accurate, but they're not really seeing all the system screens. Then it could miss them, and that's a problem. But if you put it in the PI certification, you know you'll catch everyone. And so you can look back and forth, and you can build business rules so only the people that need to see it will see it, which minimizes data entry time. And you can start to have some of those conversations and start out with, there's this big thing, this need, we want this to display here, and then sort of like just trim down. Well, we don't want everyone to see it. Is that possible? Well, you know, we don't want the admins to have to worry about it. They're not going to know the answer to that question. Okay, how can we make that happen? And really start to think about how to let everyone do this work with the least wasted time possible, which is a lot of what UX comes down to with sort of administrative enterprise software like Kuali. So a couple things, you know, where can you focus? You have these user stories, you've done a sort of workflow, and you know where that workflow varies, and you've tied that to the personas, maybe user stories about, you know, how are these personas really going to use the system. But where can you really focus? The biggest term I've heard is you don't know what you don't know. There's a lot of functionality in any big enterprise system, certainly in quality research, but really this applies to all enterprise administrative systems, that you don't tend to train functional users on. But if the functional users are in the implementation team and trying to think about how to use the system, they need to know. The two big examples of this are the custom forms, where you can build a questionnaire, you can collect all of the kind of bits of information your specific institution needs when a proposal goes in. What are the options? What can the question types look like? You know, can you do drop downs? Can you do multi-select? Can you do, you know, yes, no, NA, yes, no, other options? What can you and can't you do with the system? And so taking some time at the beginning of the implementation process to take your whole team, and don't train them on how to set up the questionnaire or the form, but show them what's possible. Really do hear an example of all the question types. This is the sort of logic we can use to do branching questions, to only show people what they need. So they kind of have an idea of their possibilities, because then they'll know what to ask for. You know, I would rather have the person that asks for the sky but will take no for an answer than the person that doesn't really know that the system can even, you know, display questions based on other data in the system. And so they never ask, even though if they kind of had that idea in their head, they would be the one that realizes, hey, that's going to save us a minute on every proposal. Because streamlining the amount of time spent on every proposal, even by 10, 15 seconds, you know, over a year's worth of proposals, that makes a big difference. So doing that training, even though it's easy to think, oh no, that's for our system admin, that can make a big difference. Also with business rules, it's possible in a lot of systems, and I'll show you how this works in Kuali, to build automatic errors and warnings based on the data you've entered. And more nuanced than just this field is required, but you've entered this data over here, so you need to enter this data over here. Okay, you indicated there's human subjects on the questionnaire. Back in the compliance section, we really want you to be linking into our IRB system, or at least putting an initial indicator that that link has to happen in the future, because we drive reports and other things off of that data. And you can automatically guide your faculty or your admin staff through that process. And that's going to save a lot of time on the back end. And just thinking about what gets missed the most often. The last thing I really want to touch on in relation to this and approaching the validation in kind of that same training everyone, not on how to set it up, because that's going to be a system admin task, but on really what it can do. You know, give them a list of all the functions that are available. I can check, you know, is this person the PI? I can check if a sponsor is marked as high risk. I can check, you know, all of these other things. How much cost share is there? Those sorts of things. And let them know, here are the rules that you have available to you if you want us to do something with the information. because some information may be available to you and some information may not. So having a resource for your implementation, your more functional implementation team, so they at least know what they can ask for, will make a big difference in being able to identify what's useful. Because the system admin that knows all of that doesn't necessarily know what's useful. And so kind of finding a bridge for that can dramatically improve an implementation. So the next thing I'm going to dive into is the demonstration. Oh, sorry about that. So I've set up a proposal and I've entered a few sort of custom configurations in this proposal, validations, special questions in various portions. And I'm going to talk through why I set them up the way I did. And these all come from schools I've worked with. And in a couple cases, I'm going to talk through how you might choose to set them up differently depending on what you discover from your personas and your workflow and really understanding how things might vary at your particular institution. So we have some basic information in here, and we're going to go to key personnel. And we have this PI listed. Inez Chu is our PI, and we're going to look at their proposal person certification. So the first thing you'll notice when you get in here is I, as a user, am in this overall proposal, and I can come in and I can complete the certification. But then there's also this Notify Inez Chu button. The system has an option where I can notify Inez, and he will get a notification that lists a link that will take him directly to the certification. The reason for this is a lot of institutions where the PI isn't building the proposal for themselves, they don't really want to get into the proposal. They don't want to take the time to learn all the ins and outs of the system when all they're really using it for is to come in and certify that, yes, all the files I send my admin to upload are accurate and answer a few questions about themselves. It doesn't make sense to train them on the overall module. And you'll get resistance and pushback. If that's all they have to do, they don't want to put 10, 12, 15 clicks into that. The thing is, if you use that notification and they're not seeing the overall interface, it can impact what you can really do with the questionnaire. So if we go down here, there are a couple questions. This is just a general certification. Everything is correct. No lobbying. We've not been disbarred. Yes, I am familiar with the Procurement Liabilities Act. And then we get to this. Does the project contain a non-financial conflict of interest or a conflict of commitment? I can click blue for further explanation. So one thing you'll notice is these all have blue information icons. But for the questions that don't have more information, they don't necessarily display everything. If as an institution you decide we want an explanation for every question, we want people to know that if they click on that eye, they're going to have more information, so they'll click on it. They'll know to click on it. Then in that situation, you might not need this text. If, however, you only really have extra guidance for maybe 5% of your questions, then having that little bit of explanation in your question is going to help guide your users. And so you can really have a discussion about, do we have the bandwidth to produce guidance for all of our questions? Do we not? What's going to make sense? What's going to make sure this guidance gets in front of the eyes of the users? The feature's available, it's attractive, it's easy to use, but will it be used? And what can we do to make sure that it's used? And that gets into the idea of user experience and thinking about your users and how savvy they are. If a PI submits 2-3 proposals a year, that's the only time they come in here. They really are going to need that little bit of explanation. So here we have this extra explanation, and if I click yes to that question, I'm going to go ahead and save now. So we've saved, And if I go up and turn data validation on, oh, I have to apologize. I tested this earlier and I'm not seeing it turn on now. Well, I'll describe through the validation that I had designed to go with this one. If you answer yes to this, I had a school that wanted individuals to attach a non-financial conflict of interest form. They had a conflict of interest module. We were working with it to capture all of the financial conflict of interest and commitment, but the system being implemented didn't capture this specific state non-financial COI disclosure requirement very well, and it was really more tied to the individual proposal as opposed to being tied to their overall annual disclosure. And so we talked through it back and forth and we said what's going to be most useful is if we put the question here and then based on that question they're required to add this attachment. It'll be linked to the proposal. We can train our conflict of interest staff to go into proposal and find it. We'll give them access. That's only a couple people we have to train, as opposed to if we try to get them to add it to the conflict of interest system, we'll have to train all of the faculty. And that then gets into that burden of who do we put the burden on? You know, if you have a very small staff and it's going to be easy to get them all up to speed, it's easier to put the burden on your central administrative staff. If you're dealing with a very large office, I've seen research offices with 30, 40, 50 people processing documents, you start to reach the point where, no, we need to push back on the departments a little bit and have them do a little bit more because getting the training completely consistent across a central office staff that broad might be difficult. So that's where you can kind of look at those personas and user stories and get some benefit there. The thing about this situation is you can set up this validation, this certification to happen in proposal, as I said, or you can send out the notification. If you send out the notification to your PIs, if you don't want to ask them to get into the system, then they'll complete it and they'll never see that validation screen. Whoever their admin is will see that validation screen, and then the admin is going to have to go to them and ask them to complete the form and bring it back and attach it, and that's more cumbersome. Or you might even allow them to complete the certification once a proposal has routed, being aware that if they don't answer this question until the proposal's already routed, then again, you'll sort of be past that validation process altogether, and you may have missed an opportunity. Now, in the case of the school I was working with, they didn't really have admin support. Their PIs were going to be filling out their proposals, so we were able to use this solution. But had they been doing certification during routing, during collecting institutional approvals, it wouldn't have been an option. And the question would be, which of these solutions, allowing certification and routing or capturing this requirement, adds more value and eliminates more work for our users? And so being really aware of that and having it in your timeline can improve overall experience. I've seen implementations where they realize the conflict in workflow after go live. So the sooner you can identify those things, the better off you'll be. Next, we have the actual Chinese involvement question, and I mentioned that scenario earlier. If I say yes to this, then again, I can set up a validation that will say, whoa, or no, if I say no to this, no, I do not certify, whoa, what's going on? That's a problem. That's captured up front, and you immediately recognize, before you get halfway through the review process that we need to have a conversation about this right now, and it can save a lot of time if you capture this sort of information up front. Once they've certified yes, then you can come back and ask a more nuanced question, and there was an institution I worked with that chose to do this, saying, okay, you certified that. Are you working with anyone that is receiving support that has any kind of relationship at all, with the Chinese government, including your students, postdocs? And they got very specific because they'd run into situations before where the PI certified, yes, this is fine, and then it turned out they didn't fully understand the requirement. And so this question being structured this way saves them a lot of time. when these sorts of issues come up based on their experience. So we'll go ahead and say no to that. And then, so this is an example of where you might capture some of this information directly in the person certification. Then, if we go ahead and jump down to questionnaire, and because I have validation on, it's being very prominent about what I still need to answer. This first question, will any students be paid on this grant? I'm going to say yes, students will be paid on this grant. This is another question that I worked on specifically with an institution. We do have to save for validations to show. Then if I go up to data validation, yes, so there's this warning that says you are responsible for ensuring that students paid on a research project comply with the responsible conduct of research policy. And this is one of those moments where, okay, they've answered this question, we just need to get this information to them. And right now that's a manual process. You know, when the proposal comes in for review, we look at it, we see they've indicated this, it's on a paper form. You know, we kind of put something on the paper form, but it gets difficult to put all guidance on the paper form based on any answers to any question. By building this validation and by building that won't stop submitting, will cause the validation to come up if you cleared all your errors, which will stop submission, and you have warnings left. As soon as you hit submit, which will come up and say, you have these, you should read them. Do you still want to submit with warnings? And I can go ahead and show what that looks like if I answer the rest of this questionnaire. So we've entered our information, and that's going to clear our last validation error. And I'm going to go down to summary and submit. And now I'm going to hit submit for review. Oh, I may have missed a question. Looks like I needed to hit a hard save on that. I apologize. Okay, there we go. We go to summary and submit. And if we submit for review, now we only have warnings. And if we imagine what the workflow would look like, you know, we are the person that's setting up this proposal. We've answered all the questions. We are PI. Even if we are a unit admin, we now have this guidance. We can imagine this demo URL actually goes out to a guidance page. Okay, I know I need to do this. Because you have the system automatically providing this guidance, you've now taken a burden off of your central administrative staff. So that's really going to help them in terms of time, especially if you have a lot of projects that have students included over the course of processing proposals. The other thing I really want to say about this process and sort of seeing how this functionality works is that this is a constant iterative process. You aren't going to be able to identify all of these needs when you go live with a system. Even if you were able to identify every possible place where a configuration, a questionnaire structure, a validation could make life a little bit easier on your staff, one, it would probably push your implementation out to a date that you really don't want to wait till. And two, requirements are always changing in research administration. So you might go live in March, and by November, there's a new need. And so having an implementation team that even once you're live with all your modules continues in kind of a soft implementation mode. Maybe they don't meet every week anymore. Maybe they only meet once a month or every other week, depending on how quickly you're sort of improving the system and providing new value. But they look at these suggestions, and you encourage your central staff sort of give suggestions and come forward and say, hey, we have this thing. It would be really great if it was a question. It would be really great if they answered yes to this question, a notification went out or a validation displayed. And then you can have your implementation team, some of whom are hopefully living in that office doing that work, who are really aware of what the system is capable of, start to write up proposals for how to design these dynamics and interactions. And it really can improve your overall proposal experience over a period of time. And some of it will be much simpler than what I've shown here. Sometimes it's just a simple validation. Oh, you've included NSF. We really need you to capture these NSF numbers. Oh, you've included a federal sponsor. We really have these, 3 questions that we want to ask in that scenario. It can be as simple as just recognizing that a couple extra fields are required for your institution that maybe aren't required in your proposal application, and taking the time to go and build a validation to make them required. And just iterating through that and constantly trying to improve and look at places that you're spending time that the system could help you not spend time over the life of your proposal solution can really help save a lot of resources in the long run. I think we are just about at the 15 minutes till the end mark, so I'm curious if there are any questions. Sort of go back to...
Hi, Victor. Thanks. While we're giving everyone else extra time to enter in any questions, I just wanted to thank you again so much for sharing your experiences with us. We know that you've been actively involved in a lot of implementations that you've seen a lot, like this little owl. And I'm sure your reaction sometimes is just like the little owl.
It is occasionally a little bit like the owl.
One of the questions that we are being asked is that when you were doing that example where you were looking at the questionnaires and there was a little blue information question mark area that you could select, are there any sources that you use generally when you're trying to help get that information? Like, what's your jumping off point to getting like a template of content information that you would potentially use when you're working with your implementation?
So in my experience, what goes in that guidance area per question really varies dramatically by question. I've never worked with any kind of template. It generally tends to be links out to government regulations. I worked with a school that also built a NASA certification, but they did it a little differently than the example that I gave here, and they did provide a link out to the government website that had those regulations. They wanted to really show that link, and they felt that having that there was important for the faculty. So the faculty didn't feel like, oh, why is this question being asked? I've also seen a lot of links out to university policy or just clarification on terms, but all of those things end up being structured differently. You reference regulations a little differently than you define a clinical trials term. I find clinical trials questions have a lot of term definition in them. And it's very different, to go a little outside of the proposal realm. I've done a lot of questionnaire work with IRB, and the way they approached their guidance was very different from how the proposal team that I'd worked with approached their guidance. So yeah, there isn't a great fixed template. It's more just what extra information would be useful. What questions do we get about this question, and can we just proactively answer them?
I see. And when you're working through the questions that you want to ask, I think that you mentioned something about how you can have it trigger based on other information in the system. Is there a way that I could ask a question that's not specifically a question that has a yes or no type of answer, but I think that you had said something about how I could have the responses be from somewhere in the system too?
Yes. So let me dive back into this proposal because there is an example of more than yes, no. So if we go to the questionnaire, and down here there is this multi-select question. This particular question type, you set up the multi-select sort of manually. The other thing you can do, which is not currently set up here, is you can set up a lookup that will go to other data in the system. You can have a lookup that will go out to, say, your person table. If you have a question about someone who's involved in some peripheral way to the proposal, you don't want them on the personnel tab necessarily, but you do want them listed, then you can go out and look at your person table and have the individual list them there. The other thing is I've seen questions about, is this proposal being transferred from another institution? And then have the lookup go to your organization table or your sponsor table. And that way you can go back, since you have a fixed, defined answer as opposed to free text, you can go back and report on that and see where our grant's being transferred from, if that's something that gets requested. And that also kind of gets to the difference between usability for your end users and really the data that you need for usability on the back end to do reporting, to have your staff easily get to what they need to see and have it in the right format and not need to do follow-up. So having some of those required structured questions can help a lot with that, and giving a lookup where they cannot enter an inappropriate response really helps a lot.
Thanks, Victor. That was a really good example. That's very helpful. I have a question next that I think probably is more of a question for me since I'm the product owner, but the question is, will Kuali eventually allow hyperlinks in the questionnaire explanation field? It only allows text right now. So right now you can not add the hyperlinks to the question itself, but in the expanded definitions section that Victor was showing, and that we do plan to expand that so that both the question and the information will be possible to have in inserted links so that you can have people jumping out directly to a source like Victor was mentioning.
Mm-hmm.
And Victor, I think that you have some experience with that also. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so just a little bit of advice on adding links into questions or into question explanation text, because I have done that. Be sure when you create that link that you put a target blank on your link, because the way you add links or formatting is you just use HTML, and Kuali respects that HTML. The downside of that is if you just put the link, it will open it in the window you're in and wipe out your proposal, which is not a great user experience for anyone. And by wipe out, it doesn't delete it from the system, but it takes you out of Kuali midstream, and then the person will have to go back and they'll have to search for their proposal, and that's not an ideal experience. But when you create the link, you can put target _ blank, and then it'll always open in a new tab, or depending on the browser, I suppose maybe sometimes a new window, but most modern browsers, it'll be a new tab, and that'll be a much better experience because then they won't be taken out of their proposal.
Good point. We definitely don't want to leave what we're working on.
I have made that mistake before.
Another question here is relating to conditional questionnaires, and when you've set up a situation where it's only going to be displayed when certain criteria are met. Mm-hmm. Do you know, or have you experienced what happens when that questionnaire is required and the proposal is already en route with the condition requiring it also being triggered at that time?
So that gets back to the conversation, or the part of the presentation where I talked about the proposal person certification. And that's the one part of the proposal that can really get edited once something's en route if you turn that option on. So if you want to drive a secondary questionnaire in the main questionnaire area off of that proposal person certification, it's important for you to understand your desired workflow and understand that you might be introducing that scenario you're talking about. because once a proposal goes into routing, all of the data is locked down except for that proposal person piece. And so the overall questions are locked down as well. Now, there is a feature called, I think it's proposal data override, where a sort of central admin super user can go in and change individual fields. It might be possible to trigger, you know, a questionnaire requirement off of one of those changes, and that could lock things up. That's a case where you really want to limit that functionality to super users and give them a good sort of guide on what triggers what. And look at which fields you make available for edit, because you can also control which fields they're even able to edit with that function. And knowing, okay, if we make this field available for editing, it opens this risk up. Those are important things to track when you sort of build your business rules.
Very good. It looks like we have just about another couple minutes. Did anybody else have any questions that they wanted to ask? And I do see some questions that seem like they are very specific, so we'll be sure to follow up with those people directly offline afterwards. Okay. Well then, in that case, I just wanted to thank you again, Victor, for sharing exactly what you've gone through in the past and some of those hard questions that come up, and thinking about weighing the difference between saving the PI some time or being the research administrator some headaches, and weighing that and trying to decide what's most beneficial for a particular scenario, and some other pitfalls that we try to avoid. That I did want to mention to everyone on the call today, both that if you came in a little late and you didn't hear, that this is recorded and we'll distribute it after the meeting is over, but that this was also one of our blowout sessions where we had record-breaking attendees in the hundreds, so we recognized that this was probably something that was meeting a need for a lot of people, and we do ask that at the end of this webinar you'll see a little pop-up box that we'll ask for some feedback, and as part of that, if you could also provide some ideas, some struggles that you're having at your institution, whether it be related to a specific system or not, that we would love to take the opportunity to have that discussion in another webinar. So thank you so much for joining us, and an extra special thanks to you, Victor, for doing this presentation for us today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.